So I had the opportunity about 11 years ago to go on a trip that changed my life. And I don't take that lightly. I know a lot of people say like this burger changed my life or that picture changed my, I mean like this trip changed my life. Here's how much it changed my life. I was a broke college student just about 6 weeks away from getting married. We didn't have a checking account. We just had a savings account. We paid everything out of our savings account. I went and got a cashier's check for my rent every single month. We were just broke as a joke, right? And I came away from this trip going, we need to give hundreds of dollars to this organization that I went with. I went on a trip to Thailand and Cambodia, and most of the trip was spent in Cambodia. And I was familiar with Thailand a little bit, right? Cambodia was a complete mystery to me, and I did not really bother at 21 years old to look up a lot of stuff on Cambodia before I went. So we get there, and one of the first things that this guide tells us on this trip is he said, I want you to notice that an entire generation is missing. And that piques my interest, right? Because I'm like, what's he talking about? Back in the mid-70s, a man named Pol Pot with his group called the Khmer Rouge, they came into Cambodia. And when they started in 1975, the population was about 7 million people. And 4 short years later, the population would have dwindled by about 3 million people. But about 4 million people left after Pol Pot would be taken out of power because Pol Pot, what he did was he decided that he was going to not just come in and take over, but he decided that in society there were 3 tiers of people. The lowest tier of people, these were people that we really shouldn't want anymore. And so he threw them into labor camps that very much resembled concentration camps from World War II. And so the tour guide tells us, I want you to notice an entire generation is gone. He begins to explain it. And the first place they take us to, they call the killing fields. Now, I'll just be honest with you. There's no kids in here, but just so you know, except for Henry. But I don't think he's going to remember. He's not even a year old yet. This was pretty graphic, right? And honestly, was very disturbing to hear about 11 years ago. They took us to the killing fields, and this is just a field with a lot of trees, and it's kind of goes up and down. Everything kind of changes, and you would see clothing that had just kind of risen to the top of the ground, top of the soil. And they explained to us how the Khmer Rouge, what they would do is if you weren't strong enough to work in a labor camp, but you were considered one of these non-desirables, they would take these women and children into these fields. A couple of them would grab them by the ankles or by the wrist and swing them into a tree until they died, and they would bury them in very shallow graves. And then they took us to one of these prison camps, one of these labor camps. And upon arriving, what you see is they would, as a way of glorifying how many they killed, they would stack the skulls up into pyramids, sometimes 10, 12, 13 feet high. And then they took us through these rooms where you would see where people were held, where people were tortured. And one room that has stuck with me, that I think will forever stick with me, was this room where it just had shackles lined up all throughout the room, and they would tie them down, laying down on their backs, and they would just leave them there to die. They would not feed them. They would not give them water. They would not let them up to walk or to change themselves. They just laid there in their own filth and in the filth of the people next to them until they eventually died. And I remember walking away from that, and all I could think was like, what drives a person to do these kinds of things? Right? Because if we look through history, we see plenty of people like Pol Pot. Pol Pot is not an anomaly. I by no means think that he's a man that is normal, but we see people like this all throughout history. We're very familiar, right, with World War II and Adolf Hitler and the just terrible things that were done to Jewish men and women and children and others that they decided needed to not be a part of society. We've seen things happen in other countries and heard of things happening in other countries like Syria that when you see the pictures, it almost jolts you because it gives you this back to this sense of reality that not everything is okay, and that even though everything might seem fine in Akron, Ohio, or Cuyahoga Falls, or Fair Lawn, or Wadsworth, or Ravenna, even though everything seems fine here, not everything in the world is okay. What we know is this, is that all throughout the history of the world, there have been men who honestly just love to watch the world burn, who just love to see things fall apart, who love to introduce chaos. And they do it for a reason. They have their own reasons, even if we would disagree with them. But there have been men like this for as long as men have been around. And one of those guys that really we need to understand just a little bit about to understand where we're at in 1 Peter is a man named Nero. Nero was the emperor of Rome when Peter wrote this letter. Now, we believe this letter was written somewhere between 60 to 65 AD, so about 32 years or so after Jesus would have been resurrected, or when many of these events would have happened here in the letter of 1 Peter. And here's what we know about Nero, is Nero, just so he could rise up to power, he killed his own mother. He definitely killed his first wife. Most believe that he killed his second wife. And Nero, he loved to just do whatever he wanted to do, right? Because when you're a person of power, you get a God complex. You just feel like you can do whatever. And so he wanted to build new buildings all throughout Rome, and the Senate decided they didn't want that. So most people believe that Nero himself set Rome on fire because he thought, if they won't let me build more, maybe they'll let me rebuild once I burn it down. So this fire burnt for 6 days, went away, and then the next day it started burning again for another 3 days. Now, when Nero started catching blame for this, because once again, if you've got a God complex, you think nobody's going to criticize me. When Nero started catching flack for this and started catching blame for this, he decided, I need a scapegoat. I need somebody else that I can say they did this and it's their fault. So Nero decided to pick on this rather small group that was spread throughout Rome. He decided to make sure that people thought the Christians were the problem. And so to prove that Christians were the problem, he decided it wasn't just enough to say they were the problem, but if they were the problem, then I have to act like they are the problem. And so he begins to arrest Christians and begins to torture them in ways that are unimaginable. Right? 2 ways. Once again, I know you guys are like, I don't know if I can take more of this, but 2 ways that he would torture the Christians. Some of you guys are like, oh. He would throw them into a cage and cover them in animal skins with a wild animal and watch them eaten alive. Or he would dip their body in wax, take their wrist, tie them to a tree, and use them like a human candle and burn the entire tree. I say that to say this. Being a follower of Jesus Christ, when Peter wrote this first letter, was about the riskiest thing you could do in their day. To declare yourself to be a follower of Jesus Christ, when Peter wrote his first letter to these Christians spread all throughout Rome, all throughout the region, the riskiest thing you could do was publicly associate yourself as a Christian. And the greatest desire they had is a desire that many of us have roughly 2,000 years later. They just want to fit in. They just want to hide. They don't want people to know who they are. They don't want people to know that there's something different about them. They just want to stay incognito as much as they can. And yet Peter, he's going to write this letter really declaring one big thing, and he's going to unveil it here in verse 1 in just a second. But what he wants us to know is this, and what we're going to talk about for this entire series, is that God has called you to be different. God has called you to be different. Not just you, myself as well, but God has called us as followers of Jesus to be different. In fact, here's what he writes, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. He says this. He says, this letter is from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And notice what he says. This is so important. He says, I am writing to God's chosen people who are living as foreigners. Foreigners. If you have your Bible, I underline that word foreigners because that gives us the framework for the entire letter of 1 Peter. He says, you are living here as foreigners in the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. You are foreigners. And when we translate that word foreigner, what it literally means is foreigner is exile, alien, sojourner. In other words, you by design are not meant to fit in. You, by design, are called to be different. You, by deciding to follow Jesus, when Jesus came, he decided to reveal himself to you, and you decided to follow, you no longer were like everyone else. You were called to be different. Now, that's incredibly difficult in their day and can be difficult in our context depending on where we find ourselves. It's difficult to understand that God has called you to be different because we know that sometimes being different comes with trouble. Sometimes being different, things then also don't go easily. Different and easy rarely go together. And in fact, Peter understood this. He understood that not only has God called you to be different, but he also understood that your trials, these hard times in your life, are guaranteed. That trials are guaranteed. Your trouble is guaranteed. Peter heard this not just from his own intuition, but he heard this from Jesus. In John 16, Jesus said this to Peter and the other followers in John 16:33. He said, I have told you this. He's told them all these bad things that are about to happen, all this stuff that's about to be rough. He says, I've told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, notice what he promises. You will have many trials and sorrows. So Jesus doesn't say you might have trouble, things might be difficult for you if you do the wrong thing, like karma's going to happen. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying by the nature of your existence and who you've decided to live for, you will have many trials and sorrows. But then he says this, take heart, for I have overcome the world. Now, that does not mean that life was going to be easy for them. We know just from Christian tradition of the 11 disciples who were left after Judas killed himself, 10 of them were brutally killed. Many were crucified. One of them, John, they tried to kill him. They tried boiling him to death, which was another thing the Romans would try to do, and he just didn't die. So they sent him onto an island just to exile him with some other prisoners, right? Let him just die, live out his days there in brutal conditions. So he's not saying life's going to be easy. He's saying, hey, you will, I guarantee you, have many trials and sorrow. Life is full of trials. Trials are guaranteed, but take heart. Jesus says, I've overcome the world, which I think really informs what Peter writes here in 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 6. Peter says this. He says, so be truly glad. Now we read that and we go, oh, be truly glad, joy, right? That's the fruit of the Spirit. That's awesome. But remember, he's writing this to people whose loved ones have been killed for their faith. He's writing this to people who probably went to school with someone who had been burned alive while stuck to a tree. He's telling them to be truly glad even though your family member won't be at the reunion next year because they were eaten alive by a wild animal. He says, so be truly glad. So what makes him able to say that? He says, there is wonderful joy ahead. Wonderful joy ahead. In other words, if we can just be honest, here's what Peter's saying. Life sucks right now. Like, this is terrible. There's no way to excuse it. Peter wasn't giving like a Christian cliche, right, where he said, hey, there's always an end to the rainbow, right? Like, he's not saying anything like that. He's letting them know, hey, life's bad. But be truly glad. There is joy ahead. You can anticipate change coming. And then he says this. So there's wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. Many trials for a little while. Here's what Peter's saying, is that in this life, right? They didn't live as long as we tend to now, but in this life might feel long for you. It might feel fast, however it feels for you. Doesn't matter, but this life is just a little while compared to the much that is your existence. He said, so even if you have 90 years on this earth and every single year is filled with trouble, it's filled with trial. Those are many trials for a little while. Because 90 years of trial compared to 9,000 of joy, what is that? Right? 100 years of trouble compared to 1,000,000 years from now, what is that? Like, nobody is going to look back 500 years from now and go, you know what? I really wish things had been easier. 540 million, however you want to say it. I really wish things were easier way back then. But if we understand that Jesus, he plays the long game with our lives, that life is about eternity, it's not just about the here and now, right? Then we understand that what we're going through now, even though it's really difficult, ultimately it is for a little while. We have many trials for a little while. And then he continues here in verse 7. He says, these trials will show that your faith is genuine. In other words, Jesus, he does not tempt us to sin, but he will allow our faith to be tested. And that is not to see whether or not we'll pass or fail. Jesus is not unsure of where your faith is. But really, these trials are for us to understand that, hey, we might have some things to change. He says these trials are going to prove that your faith is genuine. They'll show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. And then he says this, he says, so when your faith remains strong through many trials, the goal of strength and faith is not to get you to it, but it's to get you through it. He says, when it remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Peter had this anticipation that everything you go through matters. And that everything you go through, how you go through it matters. And how you go through it will one day bring honor to you and honor to the Lord, or it will discredit what you said you believed about him. He's saying your faith will be tested. It will be proven to be genuine. So if you will get through it, through these many trials for a little while, it'll make a difference. And here's what I love. This is something I heard a guy say years ago, and we've said it a few times here, but I think this is very much in line with what Peter's saying here, is that when it comes to your faith, a tested faith is a strong faith. A tested faith is a strong faith. Here's why that's so important to understand that a tested faith is a strong faith. Is somewhere along the line, many of us have been either told just absolutely explicitly to our face, or we've gathered it from other places. We've been told that when we follow Jesus Christ, things get easy. And here's what happens to so many people. I've talked to so many people where this has been the case, and so many pastors that tell me the story after story of this happening in their church, where somebody makes a decision to follow Jesus. They raise their hand, or they come down front and they pray, or they just decide on their own. They decide to follow Jesus, and then life gets difficult, and all they can think is, well, if God's real and really loves me, this stuff wouldn't happen anymore. But that is not the case. Easy circumstances don't make a strong faith. They just don't. Like, I love sports. I do. I love them, all right? I love, like this week, you guys might think it's boring. I was watching golf. I was watching the Masters, okay? And here's what I love about this, is these guys, even as pros, they'll hit some terrible shots, right? I mean, just shots where you hear the whole crowd go, oh, and they're supposed to be quiet, but they can't help it because the shot was so bad. And then what you'll see is these guys, they've done this so much now and dealt with these conditions so much that they can get themselves out of trouble most of the time, right? Now, what also happens is at these same tournaments, you have amateurs come in and play. They qualify. They're great. They're like the best of the best. But they come in, and when they hit a bad shot, more times than not, guess what happens to them? They collapse. You see the leaderboard, and you see somebody's name with an A next to it for amateur. Those are two very different places, right? Because the pros, at that point in their game, they've been tested so much, they know how to deal with it. They know how to not let it get to them. They can just keep working past it. See, the goal with our faith is that we really honestly would become professionals in our faith. That we would go through the things that happen in a way, not to deny that they hurt, not to act like everything's okay, but we would get through them with our faith intact and come out stronger on the other side. Man, I remember you guys, you've heard about this, but a few years back when my wife and I went through a miscarriage, that was one of the most trying times in our faith ever. And there were times in the midst of that where both of us felt like, we don't know if we can do this anymore. We had just started this church. So I'm trying to move a church forward. At the same time, I'm understanding where my own faith is. I'm trying to walk my wife through her issues with everything, and we're just struggling. But here's what I can tell you. There came a moment, I can tell you right where we were. We were on the steps right outside of our living room, right inside our house, where we just had a conversation that changed everything. And we decided in that moment we were going to come out of this thing better than we went into it. And I'll tell you right now, I don't wish it happened, but we grew our faith through that season of life just being terrible, right? A tested faith is a strong faith. And here's what Paul, another one of these disciples, what he wrote in the book of Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. He says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. So why can we rejoice? For we know that they help us develop endurance. In other words, the stuff you go through, it's not to punish you, it's to help you grow. Now, there are some things, let's just be honest, that we go through, not because God said, hey, I want you to go through this, but because our own stupidity put us there, all right? Like, we can't blame God for our bad choices, but there are some things that are outside of our control that we go through. And there are things that God, in his wisdom, has allowed to happen because he's saying, you know what, this is for you to develop endurance. Because notice what endurance does. He said endurance, verse 4, develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. In other words, when we get that character, we start to have more and more hope that one day Jesus is going to make things right. That one day, everything's going to be changed because Jesus can do it. And he can do what we can't do for ourselves. And then he says this, verse 5, and this hope will not lead to disappointment. For we know how dearly God loves us because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with his love. The trials you go through, those tests that you have to get through, they do not prove God's absence. They definitively prove his love. There are things we go through that we are tempted to think, well, this must mean that God's disappointed in me. But if we frame it the way that God would have us frame it, we understand this. No, we're going through this because there might just be something more for me here. God might be letting me go through this so I can help somebody else through this. And can I tell you, like, let's just rewind back to the miscarriage. Can I tell you how many people over those next few months my wife got the opportunity to sit down and talk to or get on the phone with and talk to who were going through the same thing, but it's just something that many people don't talk about? But because she made a decision by faith to go through it honestly and openly, she was able to help other people. Dude, she's a rock star in my book, right? Not because she did anything. She didn't do anything to have a miscarriage. She just said, okay, this is the hand I've been dealt. Let's make the best of it. When you go through things, when these trials come, when these tests come, they are not proving God's absence or his dislike for you. They are proving his love for you. So I say all that to say this morning, right? I think of, like, what do we do with this thing? Because here's what I know. In this room, every single one of us are going through some kind of test or trial, right? Can we agree with that? It might not seem like a huge thing to somebody else, but it might be a big thing to you. It could be a health issue. It could be something in your marriage. It could be with your kids. It could be with your job. It could be with a neighbor. It could be something inside of you that you're struggling with. It could be any number of things. But every single one of us are going through something, right? And if you don't think you are right now, give it time. You're going to, right? So what do we do with that? What do we do with understanding that, hey, yeah, God loves us and this proves he loves us, but like how can I keep my own perspective healthy? How can I help myself understand this in a way that'll actually help me and help what God wants to do in my life? And I was sitting at Dunkin' Donuts the other day, of all places. Okay, they have this sandwich there that I just really like. I can't help it. I know I shouldn't eat it, but it's awesome. And I was sitting there waiting for my sandwich to cool off, and I was looking at these verses that we're reading together this morning, and I was just simply praying. I'm like, okay, God, like what do we do with this? And something came to mind that, I'll be honest, I got really excited about. Because for me, it immediately put into perspective some things I was going with on Tuesday when I was hanging out at Dunkin' Donuts. And I really feel like the Lord said this to me, and I want to share it with you. It's that today's trials set up tomorrow's victory. Today's trials set up tomorrow's victory. Now, I'm not saying victory just so you can show off how great you are. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about you getting a trophy or another jewel in your crown when you get to heaven. That's not what we're discussing here. I'm just saying things you go through today, if you process them the right way, can absolutely lead to victory tomorrow. And it might not be victory for you. It might be victory for somebody else. Right? But what you go through today, man, that can set up tomorrow's victory. The trial you go through today can set up tomorrow's victory. So I got two questions for you. Okay, first thing is this, is what is God bringing you through today? What is God bringing you through today? Now, I ask it that way because I'm just assuming that you're going to keep your faith through this and we're going to get stronger through whatever we go through. But what is God bringing you through today? What is going on in your life today that you feel like, man, this trial, this test is just dragging me down? What is God bringing you through today? What's happening? If you were honest with yourself, what comes into mind? All right, for some of you, you might have to think, for some of you, the second I asked that question, something came to mind. Hit you like right in the forefront of your brain. What is God bringing you through today? What if you decide today you're going to approach it with faith? What can God help you get through? The second question is this. Not only is what is God bringing you through today, but the second question is, what are you going to learn for tomorrow? What are you going to learn for tomorrow? Like for some of us, the best thing you could do today is not just be honest with what's wrong in your life, but also anticipate what might God be teaching me through this? Like what lesson might God be showing me right now? I heard a pastor say this a few years ago. I thought it was great. He said, God will never allow you to fail a test. It won't happen. But he will allow you to retake it until you pass. And for some of us, man, you maybe have been taking the same test over and over and over again. Like, can I just be honest? One of my biggest tests in my life is I get very excited about something, and it's really hard for me to follow through long term on it. And that is something, if I'm not careful, that can haunt me. Because then that mentality can creep into everything that I do. But here's what God's shown me. If nothing else, starting this church a little over 4 years ago, man, we can stick through it when times get hard. We can get through it when things get lean. I can bounce back when people lie about me and make things up about me, and when I lose a friend out of nowhere, I can get through it. All right, so what is God bringing you through, and what are you going to learn about it? What are you going to learn for tomorrow that's going to benefit you, benefit others? And ultimately, I mean, what is it going to do for God's kingdom and what he wants to do here on earth? Because for some of us, here's the tragedy. God's going to teach you some great things, and you're going to keep it to yourself. God's going to show you great mercy, and you're going to keep it hidden from somebody else. What we go through isn't just about us, but it's about Jesus. It's about what he wants to do and how it can help others. So if you